Okay, in this module, we're largely going to talk about the Revolutionary era in Latin American history, which lasts from about 1790 into the 1820s, give or take exactly which country you want to talk about. And to accomplish that, we really have to start and go back in time to trace the development of revolutionary ideas from the 1600s in Europe until they get into Latin America around the year 1800 or so. So in order to do that, we have to go back in time and talk about the philosophical movement known as the Enlightenment that gets going in the 1600s and generally what it's about, what it tries to accomplish, and how one offshoot of the Enlightenment gets into political theory and theory of governments and eventually starts developing revolutionary theory. So we'll talk about the major book that kind of brought all those ideas together and how that book in the next section would inspire, in a lot of ways, the two major revolutions in Europe that hit in the late 1700s, the American Revolution of the 1760s and 70s, and then the French Revolutions that start in 1789. And in this lecture, we'll go forward into the 1790s and early 1800s. That leads us down the road to talking about how France had a relationship with the rest of Europe once its own revolution started. Basically, the rest of Europe will kind of view France as a revolutionary enemy and will declare war on France. And those so-called French Revolutionary Wars of the 1790s and early 1800s, as these European powers fight amongst each other, that will start infighting among their colonies in the Americas. And so all this kind of snowball effect going throughout the whole 1700s will eventually lead to the rise of different revolutionary movements in different Latin American colonies, starting in 1790 and then going into the early 1800s. So by the end of today, we're going to get to the point where we can define what's going on in Europe so that we can, in future lectures in this module, understand how the individual revolutions in Latin America developed in different countries. So the first section was going to just talk about the general Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment was a general kind of philosophical movement coming out of the 1600s when Europe underwent a different type of movement, intellectual movement called the Scientific Revolution. Other philosophers will take up that idea of natural laws and they'll start to apply it to other things outside of the hard sciences. And that's where the Enlightenment will start to rise. New philosophers will take that idea of natural laws and they'll apply it to all kinds of human experiences and human decision making. So you'll get some of these philosophers will start to study how do governments make certain decisions about taxation. And so you'll get economics as a discipline will rise out of that as a social science. A lot of other philosophers will study how do people make decisions according to morality or immorality. Why do they make certain other types of anti-moral decisions? So you'll get psychology and philosophy starting to rise as kind of disciplines. The Enlightenment philosophers want to use reason, use logical thought and study and research, not just as a method to gain some type of knowledge, but they say that the more you use logical thought and the more you use this research, that will build up your logical understanding of the world around you, which will lead you to more logical pursuits. And it goes higher and higher and higher as you build up not just reason as a method to get there, but reason is the goal. You become more reasonable, more logical in the world. So the Enlightenment is very optimistic that they have discovered these kind of secrets of research and learning that if just pursued rationally, pursued logically, will build up human knowledge to the point where humans can really solve every major problem that they confront in the world. They can solve famine, they can solve floods, they can solve political crises, they can solve people's psychological problems. So the Enlightenment is extremely optimistic for the future of humanity. So we'll just go through some of the biggest and most important books for political philosophy coming out of the Enlightenment. One of the big early ones is from a guy named John Locke, who was one of the major Enlightenment figures who studied all kinds of different topics like morality and education and things like this. But he also wrote a couple of big books on government in the late 1600s. So Locke's most famous book, his most important book for the revolutions, is called the Second Treatise, the second pamphlet basically on civil government. So it's a fairly short book, and he lays out some very, very important ideas that others will take up and push forward later. His explanation is that people generally get sick of being afraid all the time, so people started at some point to come together and made a deal on a probably small community level to create some kind of political government to create laws and punish the people who would break those laws. But in doing so, those people have to give up some of their freedom, some of their power. Namely, they agree to give up the freedom to attack and kill whoever they want whenever they want. So that's the basic deal that Locke describes. People come together in a community and they agree amongst themselves that this perfect absolute freedom is not doing good things for most of society. So a good deal is for people to give up those extreme freedoms, those freedoms to harm other people basically. They give those up to the kind of common, and they give the power to a government to write laws. So they're going to create what becomes known as a legislature, a group that will write laws that the community will approve. So usually they'll write laws that make murder illegal, that make rape and theft and extortion and all these bad things illegal. And then they'll create some type of law enforcement body. So some type of law executor, a group or a power of the government that will execute the laws, that will enforce the laws, and punish the lawbreakers. So Locke is describing this in pretty vague terms. I mean, he doesn't have a lot of historical evidence for exactly when and where this happened and what the first government was or anything like that. But it's a general philosophical statement that this is probably how the first government started to rise just out of the problem of anarchy. But when you create a government, Locke also recognized that that could create a whole nother problem. And namely, what happens when the government gets out of hand and the people running the government become more interested in keeping their own power than they are interested in enforcing the law for the kind of equality and benefit of everybody. So Locke says the next step is that when the government gets so out of hand, when the legislature, the lawmakers, or the executive, the law enforcers, act, quote, against their trust, against the public, the government's purpose is to enforce equality and stop people from harming each other. But if the government is becoming a threat to the people by becoming a kind of tyranny, where the government leaders kind of enforce really brutal laws against the people just so the leaders can stay in power, Locke says that that's not a good thing. That's when the government has broken the deal, because the government's supposed to protect people's lives and equality and property. But when the government gets out of hand, they have act against their trust. And the government itself is becoming a threat to the people. Locke wrote that at that time, the people have the right to revolt against the government because they're the ones who built the government in the first place. It's their government. And if the people don't like what the government is doing, the people have the right to basically trash can that government system, get rid of that, and build up a new government to do the job again, to protect people's lives and equality and property. So Locke has a general theory of where governments came from, why they started to happen, and a general theory of that becomes known as the right to revolution. The people have the right to revolt against their government because they're the ones who created it. It's like it's their property. And if they don't like what the government is doing, they have the right to get rid of it and replace it with something new. And a lot of these complaints will also reach into the revolutions that we'll see rise in the later 1700s, and even in the Latin American revolutions that we'll see break out toward the end of this module. And those will start to have a pretty large effect. One interesting thing is that they didn't really have much of an effect in the Latin American colonies. It seems that a lot of these Enlightenment books and articles and kind of pamphlets and whatnot, they do make their way into the Latin American colonies, mostly through clergy and government bureaucrats that are educated enough to be able to read this stuff, and they have some money to buy the books and whatnot. But the elites, they kind of read these books. They don't seem to really debate it much, at least not out in the public, not out in society. Maybe they kind of debate it amongst their own private parties and houses or something like that, or their own get-togethers, but not really so much in public settings. So the Enlightenment doesn't really have a whole lot of an effect on the Latin American elite, or even in the average people who are complaining, as we've talked about before, about government reforms and government inefficiencies. So these massive statements about what government should be and people have the right to revolt against bad government, that doesn't really reach the Latin Americans very much, because the revolt ideas in Latin America aren't really revolutionary to get rid of the whole government. They're more kind of demanding government reforms to make their tax collection better or make their trade more efficient. All right, and now we're going to get into kind of the real world political results of a lot of these Enlightenment theories. And really, one of the first big attempts at revolution, according to these Enlightenment theories, is in what becomes the United States, what a lot of textbooks call the American Revolution. And this revolution started off in the 13 colonies, the 13 British colonies in North America. And it starts off as a direct result of that giant war that ended in 1763. Basically, the British government was really in debt because they had to borrow money to win the war. And they figure after the war is over in 63 that they're going to start raising tax rates to pay down their debt, to get more government revenue to pay off the national debt. So they start raising taxes in their colonies and in Britain itself. And these tax increases anger a lot of portions of the population in the 13 colonies, and that starts off a type of rebellious type movement where people complain about the taxes, and then the government sends in more troops to enforce the taxes, which angers the people even more because now they're afraid that the government is arresting people and starting to tyrannize over the colonies. So that's the general debate from 1763 going into the mid 1770s, when actual fighting breaks out between some colonial militias that start to define the British Army as not really helping them and defending them, but kind of controlling them and oppressing them instead. So a revolutionary war breaks out amongst the kind of most extreme radicals in the colonies versus the British Army. And that fighting starts in 1775. And this map you see here is a map of the big invasion points of the British Army where they feel that they can invade these different colonies to defeat the revolutionaries. But the big thing for all this talk about politics that comes out of the American Revolution is a document called the Declaration of Independence. And that is exactly what it sounds like. It's the colonists declaring independence, saying that we want to become independent countries now. And the Declaration is a statement to the world of this is why we want to become independent countries. And it really goes according to a lot of these Enlightenment philosophers' ideas about where government came from and what the people's relation to that government should be. So the most famous paragraph in the Declaration says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator, some type of God or something, with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So what does all that mean? It's basically really quoting Locke and Rousseau and these other philosophers and their whole theory about where governments came from. That God created everybody equally, or the creator, whatever that is, creates all people equally, and that they have certain rights that this document calls unalienable rights, rights that cannot be separated from a person. It's rights that the people retain just because they're a living, breathing person. And the next sentence says that in order to secure and keep these natural rights, the people come together and they create governments. And the problem, though, for the colonies, though, these 13 colonies, is that this form of government has become destructive of those purposes. So, whenever that happens, the people have the right to alter or abolish a government that is acting against its trust and is not protecting the people's rights, but instead is oppressing the people's rights. So this is basically calling on Locke's theory that um, this is why the American colonists are revolting against Britain and they want their own countries because Britain has been acting as a tyranny and is oppressing the people's rights. And of course, uh, if the people have the right to get rid of an old government because it's not doing its job, it's not protecting the people, people's next step is to create a new government that will instead guard their safety and happiness and their ability to follow the law. So this is the big statements coming out of the American Revolution. And again, the American Revolution is a revolution of 13 different colonies, 13 different independent governments who formed an alliance in order to fight and win the war against Britain. But after the war was over, those 13 different colonies, now states, became 13 different governments again. So they may try to cooperate, but in the end, they're basically 13 different little countries. So they each have their own governor, they each have their own laws, they each have their own constitutions, they each have their own money. So the 13 only came together to fight and win the War of Independence against Britain to guarantee their independence. And one thing that a lot of historians will argue is that Latin Americans will later look at that example and say, yeah, we have a lot of different colonies, a lot of different viceroyalties here, that maybe we should kind of cooperate in overthrowing the Spanish tyranny or the Portuguese tyranny into the future. But maybe we'll kind of revert back into independent country status after the war is over. And another thing that a lot of Latin Americans learned from the American Revolution is that the American Revolution depended very heavily on European rivalries to succeed. So the American revolutionaries will rise up against the British, but they will also invite the French army to help them because the French and British have been rivals for centuries, and the French are very happy to do so. Another big problem that historians point out, and a lot of Latin Americans point out, is that the founding ideas of the United States they always talk about liberty, equality, democracy. So those are the ideas in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the other founding documents. But the problem is that once the country actually starts to function, the new United States government starts to behave like just any other European imperialist country. So the United States will continue to allow slavery. They will use genocide against Native Americans to gain more land. The U.S. government will be absolutely obsessed with gaining more territory for its first 80 years or so. They're going to go off and conquer a large chunk of the North American continent, and then they're going to get into industrialization, the building of factories. So the United States government may talk about these Enlightenment ideas of liberty and equality and unalienable rights and whatnot, but in the real world, when they start making decisions about how their government functions and what its goals are, it starts looking like just any other oppressive force in the world. And all this leads us into the French Revolution that will start just a few years after the American Revolution succeeded and built up its own government. So the French Revolution starts, interestingly, in almost the exact same year that the U.S. Constitution is written, 1788, 1789. And the details of why the French Revolution happened, historians have written many, many books on that, so there's a long list of arguments. But generally, they all agree on the French government was going broke. It had too big of a national debt. Its tax collection was too inefficient. Its rich people were avoiding taxes almost completely, so really the poor were paying most of the taxes, and it just wasn't enough money to keep the government running. So the French king called an ancient body called the Estates General to meet in May 1789 to advise the king to reform the tax code, basically, and reform the government to really, get the government back on its feet. But the king says that he's really only going to listen to the first estate, the first two estates. So the third estate is going to be kind of left out in the cold. And the third estate gets really pissed off about that. And they start to argue that since they were elected by the general population, and that general population does all the useful work in society, they grow all the food, they're the ones that do all the labor, basically, that the third estate will argue that they are the legislature of the country. They are elected by the people who do all the work. So the third estate will try to take power, and they eventually will. And they will start to write a constitution later that summer in August of '89. And that constitution will eventually do some pretty radical things for the French government. Number one, it cuts the king down to size and merely makes the king into the executive branch of what they call a constitutional monarchy. So they're writing a constitution that's going to give specific powers to the different branches of government, and the king is reduced to merely being the executive branch. The Constitution will do is just abolish feudalism. So that whole social, economic, and political system in France one day is just gone when the legislature just votes it out of existence one night on August 4th. They just take a vote in the middle of the night, and suddenly there is no more feudalism in France. So that was a gigantic change. The Constitution will also remove all nobility. So these landowners might keep their land because they have property. I mean, they've bought the land and whatnot. They've paid for it. So they're still landowners, but they do not have an official title. They're not called dukes or counts or lords or anything like that anymore. Those titles are gone. And because the titles are gone, their tax exemptions are gone. So these landowners are going to have to start paying taxes on the scale of really everyone else in society. And that really angers a lot of the nobility and the landowners because they don't want to pay taxes and they want their privileges back. The Constitution will also basically get rid of the Catholic Church. So Catholicism is basically wiped out by law in revolutionary France. And the lands around the church, the church has the property that the church sits on, but also owns farmland kind of around the church. So a lot of that land is nationalized, which means the government takes over that farmland and they sell it at auction. And any tithes, local taxes on the common people, usually in sales taxes, to fund the local Catholic Church, all those taxes are abolished. Those taxes that directly funded the church's operation in their locality. So the church is going to have to figure out how to survive on its own economically without all those privileges and income streams. And the introduction to the Constitution will basically give the general Enlightenment political theory of equal rights and universal equality and whatnot. And eventually, the French Revolution will follow through after a couple more years, and they will abolish slavery. So they will become the first major European power to make slavery illegal in France and illegal in the rest of their worldwide empire. So the big groups who really hate all these reforms and hate the Constitution, number one, the king, because he doesn't like his power kind of cut down. The Catholic Church hates the whole Constitution because they're losing a lot of power and wealth. But the biggest group that hates it are actually the landowners. And they hate the Constitution. And when they start to say so publicly, the public will often gather outside their homes and threaten them. So a lot of the landowners become very, very afraid of just being killed by these kind of rapidly revolutionary people out there in society. So a lot of these landowners decide to emigrate. They decide to leave France and go somewhere else because they see basically the writing on the wall that this could become very dangerous for them and their family. So the revolutionary leaders start to get very paranoid that les émigrés, the émigrés, are conspiring with foreign governments and powerful foreign governments like Britain or Prussia or Austria to raise armies and invade France and destroy the revolution. So in order to stop that, the French government declares war on Austria in spring of 1792 and then on Prussia. And those are the two of the biggest military powers in Europe at the time. And as all this starts to happen, the French king starts to complain, and the government actually imprisons the king, and then they put him on trial for treason, and they execute him in public in January 1793. So this is a painting of the king has just had his head cut off, and you see the guy on the right standing on the stage holding something up, and that's the king's head, showing it to all the people that are gathered to cheer the king's murder. And this really outrages a lot of monarchs throughout the rest of Europe who saw the French king as a victim. And a lot of royalists and monarchists all over Europe, they now hate the French Revolution for having killed the king. They say this is basically a crime. And those governments will start to form an alliance that becomes known as the First Coalition. So the biggest, most powerful governments in Europe at the time, Britain, the Dutch Republic, Spain, they all get involved in this war with Prussia and Austria. They form this gigantic alliance to all basically try to attack France from all sides at the same time. And Spain gets involved in this because of a Spanish advisor to the king named Godoy, who really declared, joined the idea that the French Revolution's murder of their own king was a giant crime, and Godoy, the prime minister, pushes Spain to form an alliance with the First Coalition to invade and defeat the French Revolution. The problem, though, for Godoy and others is that they cannot defeat the French Revolution. The French popular armies come out to fight against professional soldiers, and they actually win, and they win big. So the First Coalition is defeated by the end of the summer in 1794. And this has gigantic results for Spain. France wins the war, really forces Spain into a peace treaty in 1795, even while the rest of the First Coalition is still trying to fight it out. So Spain kind of gives up on the First Coalition before anybody else and signs this treaty in 1795 and gives up a lot of land to France. Number one, Spain gave up all of the Louisiana Territory back to France. And number two, gave the eastern half of Hispaniola, this map on the right, the major island in the middle, the first place that Spain had colonized in the New World. France had already taken over the western half. That's why the western half of the island is in blue. So after this year, 95, France is going to own all of Hispaniola. And France will force Spain into an alliance to fight off any future attempts by another coalition to invade France. So Spain is just this military debacle forces Spain to kind of join France at the hip, and that will continue causing major problems into the future. The biggest problem is that the British were just livid that Spain would sign a separate peace with France and get involved with the French alliance. So Britain was so angry at this, what they called the betrayal of the first coalition, that Britain starts harassing Spanish ships out in the ocean, which it can get away with because it has the biggest navy in the world. And that eventually leads to a full-scale war in 1797 that'll go on for a couple of years. And again, the Spanish military suffers these gigantic defeats. And basically the Spanish Navy is really pretty much destroyed, that the British can start blockading the Spanish coastline. And they'll do that for a couple of years, and that causes even bigger problems. So when the British start blockading, especially the giant city at Cadiz, this destroys the ability of the American colonies to trade with their home country, Spain. So the British blockades really stop about 99% of all the trade coming from the Latin American colonies. And Spain knows that those colonies need trade to survive because they're not making enough of their own goods to survive economically. So the Spanish government's solution is to allow neutral traders from other countries not involved in the war to go into the colonial ports in Latin America and start buying and selling and moving goods around. So this idea became known as neutral trade. And this becomes a giant problem for Spain because this opens up the floodgates to a lot of different countries going into the Spanish colonies. And even after the war ends in 1799, Spain can never get control back over their colonies' trade again. So there's going to be a ton of smuggling, a ton of all kinds of problems when Spain just suddenly opened the floodgates and allowed all other ships from all other countries to trade with its colonies. That Godoy is forced out of office. He's forced to resign in 1798. And just after his resignation, a whole second coalition of largely many of the same powerful countries gets together in early 1799 to declare war against revolutionary France again. So the lineup of countries again is Britain, Austria, Russia, Portugal, the Ottoman Empire. They all declare war against France in 1799, again with the intention of invading France and destroying the revolution. And the French government at this point isn't running very well. So the most successful general within revolutionary France decides to take over the French government and make himself the leader of the French government. And this guy's name is Bonaparte. So Napoleon Bonaparte leads a coup against his own government. In December 1799, he basically takes the government leaders and throws them in jail, and basically takes over almost all the major powers of the government in the year 1800. He says in order to defend the revolution against all these foreign countries that are going to start invading, and to protect the revolution and guarantee all of its gains for the people. So the French Revolution's attack on monarchy in general and on the Catholic Church, on the official kind of Spanish religion, on the American colonies, because it seemed to question, if not completely remove, two of the biggest kind of pillars of colonial society, monarchy and the church. So this is what leads to a lot of instability, not just in Europe, but a lot of government and social instability in the colonies themselves. And then once the next revolution we're going to talk about next time, the revolution on Hispaniola, which will be basically a slave revolution to end slavery and create equality, that revolution will add a racial component to a lot of these debates that will impact a lot of the Latin American revolutions later on. Biggest thing internally that Napoleon does for France, it becomes known as the Napoleonic Code, or the Code Napoleon, in 1804. So theoretically, he wrote this thing himself and published it, publicized it, and said he would enforce it. But it's really him and his highest advisors who come together. And the big attempt seems to be at this point that he is going to promise the French people that as their leader, he will uphold the gains of the French Revolution. So he wants to end feudalism and guarantee that that never comes back. He wants to create full citizenship for the French people and kind of legal citizen equality under the law, um, to again remove any vestiges of feudalism and the old kind of nobility privileges system. Another thing he wants to do is create a government bureaucracy that employs professional bureaucrats, basically. People that have gone to school and they have learned about what kind of job they're going to be doing for the government. So if you want to be a government appointed kind of officer within the government, to run a specific department like tax collecting or bridge building or road maintenance or whatever, you're going to have to pass a test to take that office, to function in that office, and the test is designed to ensure that you actually know what you're doing. He also promised full religious toleration and freedom to virtually all religions in France. He would later make deals with the Catholic Church to bring Catholicism back into France, which pleased a lot of conservatives who tended to be Catholic in the country, and they wanted the church back because the French Revolution had basically destroyed the church by taking its lands in the 1790s. So a lot of political conservatives and Catholics in France were very happy that he put that in the Napoleonic Code. Another important thing from the Napoleonic Code is that he's largely going to set this thing up in all the places he will eventually conquer and otherwise control. So the Napoleonic Code will spread out from France, especially in Western Europe, very far and wide, because he's going to make these similar promises to the other countries that he conquers in order to get those populations on his side. So he can continue ruling over them basically as a European-wide empire, but we'll get into his military moves a little bit later. So a lot of these ideas and his promises are fairly popular in France. So when Napoleon is first in office in 1799, for the first 5 years or so, the French actually like him pretty well. He's you know promising to uphold the gains of the revolution, which was pretty popular amongst the people that were still in France, at least. But Napoleon, being who he is, he's very ambitious and kind of power hungry. He's not even happy just with being consul for life in 1802. So a couple years later, he has himself crowned Emperor of the French. So he is now the monarch of France. And this is where a lot of French people start to turn against him, because you can't say that you uphold the gains of the revolution by getting rid of the elite, the nobility, and all their privileges, and then crown yourself basically king. So those two ideas don't work very well together, and this is when a lot of the kind of French intellectuals and political class that want democracy, this is where they turn against him and say that what he really is a power-hungry politician. So Napoleon starts immediately after declaring himself emperor, he starts doing fairly repressive things against the French population. Number one, he shuts down any newspapers or any printers that tend to publish things that are critical of him and his government. So within a few months of declaring himself emperor, he shuts down 60 newspapers out of France's 73 that existed. So he shut down the mass majority of French newspapers in the country and started to build up internal spy networks to watch over the French population, to read their mail, their private letters that they're writing back and forth, which was obviously the big way of communicating back then was on the written page. So he's trying to read people's mail who his government feels are involved in like suspicious activity or something like that. A lot of times they don't have any evidence for it. So it's really going into the private lives of the French people, which harms their citizenship rights and whatnot. And the government will also send spies out into the average society to kind of sit in coffee houses and bars and hang out in public places and just listen to what people are saying. And they'll start writing down lists of names of people who express like anti-government sentiment or something like that. And another problem that Napoleon will face uh, pretty quickly is the reemergence of a coalition of European countries that want to start a war against him and start attacking again. So the so-called Second Coalition rises pretty quickly in 1799 when he started all this, when he promoted himself and started the coup in the first place. So there is a war from 1799 going into the early 1800s, and it's largely like the first coalition. It's a whole bunch of different powerful European countries that all agree to attack France at the same time. Um, for Spain and its government, the Spanish king, in a move I've never personally been able to understand, brought back that prime minister who made a ton of mistakes in the 1790s and really destroyed the Spanish government in a lot of ways by getting involved in those wars in the 1790s, which proved to be a disaster. For some reason, the Spanish king brings this guy back and reappoints him to be a prime minister again in 1801. And that will have gigantic effects on France. So Godoy is going to be back, and he's going to continue making a lot of really dumb mistakes. So again, it's always a mystery why anyone trusts this guy at all. Godoy's foreign policy is really important. Napoleon generally wins that war by 1802, and there's a peace treaty signed between France and its various enemies in 1802 called the Peace of Amiens. And this has direct impacts on Spain itself. Spain got involved in all this, and in this peace treaty, Napoleon forced Spain to be an ally of France for the long term. And Godoy goes along with it. And in order to end the war, Spain has to pay off a lot of France's enemies, especially Britain, by giving some of its Caribbean colonies, some of these tiny little islands, to Britain and some of the other powers. So a lot of Spanish people see that as absolutely humiliating. And furthermore, somehow Godoy allowed Napoleon the right to basically run Spanish foreign policy. So Napoleon, the French leader, is going to decide when Spain goes to war and how many troops it's going to send. So that basically is going to make Spain into a puppet of Napoleon, and Spain is under this kind of alliance is going to be dragged into Napoleon's wars for years and years. That'll do a lot of damage to France. And not only is Napoleon getting that power over France, but over Spain, but Spain has to pay to allow Napoleon to rule them. So that's an even greater level of just insanity. And a giant anti-Godoy faction breaks out in Spanish politics. It basically says that Godoy is completely untrustworthy, and the guy who appointed him is also completely untrustworthy, and that's the king. So for Spanish people to say that about their own king is a whole new kind of realm of disbelief that a lot of Spanish people had never even considered getting involved in the centuries before. So Godoy has taken the Spanish kind of political ideology into a whole new dangerous place. So, but in 1803, Napoleon has these other problems. He's fighting wars all over the world, and one of his biggest problems is that Britain declares war again in 1803, and that's what convinced him to really sell Louisiana. So Napoleon has to start developing plans about how he's going to defeat Britain in this new war. And his giant plan is to build up a gigantic French and Spanish army, and he starts doing that in 1803. And Napoleon is very good at building armies quickly and training them and making them, kind of molding them into some of the most powerful fighting forces in the world. He's really a genius at that stuff. So Napoleon builds what he calls the Grand Army, the Grande Armée. And he's building it in France for the most part, but also in Spain because Spain is his ally. So he's building up this gigantic force. The problem, though, is that Britain is an island. So at the same time, he has to build up an armada, a whole bunch of naval ships to put the soldiers on to get them to Britain. And in order to get them to Britain, Napoleon's navy has to defeat the British navy somewhere out in the oceans. So, as this is going on over a couple of years, he's preparing his army, he's building up his navy, and finally he sends his navy out to battle the British navy. And the biggest battle happens at a place called Trafalgar, which is just off of the kind of southwestern Spanish coastline, as we see on this map. And the result of the battle is that the British force just completely annihilates the combined Spanish and French navy that showed up to fight at Trafalgar. So at that point, with his navy pretty much annihilated, that he'd spent 2 years building, Napoleon is forced to admit that he will not be able to invade Britain with his giant grand army. And he has to figure out, well, if I can't directly invade Britain, then how am I going to defeat them in this war? And the idea he hits on is to control as many other parts of Europe as possible and to force them to boycott Britain. And that means that he's going to have to, again, control the territories of Europe as much as he can. And he's going to try to control their economies. And his theory is that Britain is a trade-based empire. That if you can destroy the British economy, you will destroy the British government's tax revenue. And if they don't have money, then they won't be able to build boats and keep an army in the field. And that's how you're going to defeat them. It's basically economic warfare. So the boycott is designed as a refusal to buy any British goods or any goods that have traveled through British ports to deny Britain that tax revenue and take down their whole national economy. So that launches us into the next phase, which is called the Continental System, because the Continental System is his plan for the boycott. After 1805, he starts doing whatever he can to control all these governments all around Europe. So some of them he has kind of standing treaties with because he's already intimidated or invaded those countries and forced them to his will. So the formal French Empire that is under his direct control as leader of the French government is in the darkest green area here on the map. So from Spain all the way toward the Austrian Empire, which is here in purple in the kind of middle of Europe, and the Russians much further to the east, Napoleon has pretty much direct control over all the areas in dark and lighter green. So the Continental System kind of formally gets started in 1807. And Napoleon's big problem is really whenever an independent king stands up and says, my country's not going to participate in this giant boycott of Britain. And the most famous one that rises up pretty quickly when the Continental System gets going is the King of Portugal. I mean, he flatly says Portugal's not going to take part in this. So what is Napoleon's response? He takes a big French army and marches them from France through Spain and into Portugal to overthrow the Portuguese government and completely just take it over. Now, the Portuguese king and his advisors realized they didn't have a big enough army to possibly resist this giant French army that's coming in. So the Portuguese king and his advisors and his, their families and their adherents and all their servants and whatnot, they all pack up and they leave Portugal and they go to Brazil. So they go to the South American colony. A large amount of them, about 15,000 government officials, leave Portugal. And they go to Brazil, and they set up their government in Brazil, and they still claim to be the official Portuguese government, but they don't have much power in Portugal anymore. So a lot of Portuguese people will start a resistance movement in Portugal to try to basically launch small-scale attacks wherever they can against Napoleon's forces and try to convince them to leave Portugal. But Godoy has this treaty with Spain, or with France, between Spain and France, so he can't really speak out very publicly against Napoleon for having done all this stuff. And a giant kind of spontaneous riot happens in one of the Spanish cities where Godoy is, where there's just so much hatred of this guy amongst the Spanish people in this town that they riot in the town and they almost kill him. He barely escapes. And these riots they start growing. And the only way Godoy knows of, and the king, Charles IV, knows of, to kind of calm the rioters and end this just upheaval in the country is to force Godoy out of power. So these riots start happening in 1808, and Godoy is forced out of office. He is forced to resign in 1808, so he's out. And then quickly after that, Charles IV himself, he abdicates, which means he officially retires. So he's out in March of 1808. He's gone. And he appoints his son the next king. And this guy becomes known as Ferdinand VII. So he's now in power in March 1808 as the official king of Spain. But he doesn't last long because Napoleon, after taking over Portugal, Napoleon realizes that Spain could be a kind of hotbed of kind of anger against what France is doing. So Napoleon doesn't even trust Ferdinand VII. And Napoleon at this point basically tries to take over the Spanish government completely. But what is very clear is that by May 1808, even Ferdinand VII is out, and Napoleon has to find someone to run Spain for him. So Napoleon appoints his younger brother, Joseph, to be king of Spain. So a lot of Spanish people don't like this at all, because now they have a French guy as their king. So this becomes extremely unpopular in Spain itself, to the point that Napoleon has to keep sending French troops to Madrid to basically conquer Madrid, the Spanish capital, and keep his brother on the Spanish throne. And since this is a new government starting, Napoleon and Joseph Bonaparte, they meet with their advisors and they write up a new constitution for Spain that creates a representative legislature. But the monarch Joseph is going to have pretty much all the power in his own hands. So the legislature is kind of a rubber stamp. They're not really all that important. But the important thing about the legislature and the Constitution is that the legislature will include representatives from all of the Spanish colonies. And the Constitution says it will give equal rights to not just the people in Spain, but also the Spanish colonizers out in the colonies. So people in the Spanish colonies will also be viewed as kind of equal citizens with the Spanish people in Spain themselves. So it's going to kind of erase a lot of those distinctions. So a lot of the Spanish colonies, they like this constitution to a certain extent. They don't like who wrote it or that the French are still running Spain itself. But they'll use these ideas of full equality for the colonists as a kind of jumping off point to argue for after they say we're going to try to get rid of these French guys running Spain. But even after we get rid of them, the precedent has been set that the colonies are equal to the home country itself. So they're going to start arguing for kind of more power and more decision making in the Spanish government, even after, they say after they get rid of the Bonapartes. So going back to Europe, though, Napoleon's invasion of Portugal and his coup against Spain to gain control of those two countries really incited a giant revolution amongst many people living in Spain and Portugal, the Iberians. They come to see the French as kind of evil occupiers and usurpers, and they want to start basically a peninsula-wide revolution to destroy French power and kick them out so that Spain and Portugal can govern themselves again. But a lot of people in the colonies will start talking about, uh, if we're going to be involved in this giant revolution against the Bonapartes, then we should, have some kind of ability to run our own colony instead of waiting for orders from Spain. So there's a lot of kind of Spanish and Portuguese nationalism going on even in the colonies. But even as they start to say, in return for helping you do this in Europe, we're going to want some more power over our own colonies for the long term. And of course, France's enemies, especially Britain, sees all this revolutionary sentiment in Iberia and in the colonies as a great opportunity to weaken Napoleon. So Britain will start intervening in these revolutionary movements in Portugal and Spain against France because they see it as a good way to hurt France. So Britain will start sending a lot of money. They'll send soldiers and supplies into Iberia to help these resistance movements grow as much as they can possibly get them to flourish. And they basically view it as a good way to force Napoleon to keep sending more and more French troops into Iberia to try to retain control over Portugal and Spain. So this starts a kind of large split in colonial opinion as a result of these independence and revolutionary wars that are getting going in, especially in 1808 in Spain. And this is an image of famous painting by one of the most famous Spanish artists of the time, basically of several of the Spanish resistance members have been captured by French forces and they're being executed. They're just being shot right there on the spot. And it's an image where you see the guy in the middle with the white shirt basically saying, I love my country, so you might as well shoot me, just I have no fear of this. So it's a big kind of nationalistic type painting. And you can see that the French soldiers, you can't even see their faces, so they're kind of covered up and they're kind of portrayed in the shadows to make them look bad, to make them look evil. But this is largely the feeling that a lot of Spanish people had for what the French are doing in Spain and Portugal and attempting to do in the colonies. So all this will really start to split a lot of colonial opinion on what should the colonists be doing, what should their policy be during all of these conflicts. So the colonists, especially in the Spanish colonies, they largely split into three different kind of factions. One faction is called the Loyalists. So they are completely dedicated to the Spanish king, Ferdinand VII. They say that monarchy is good, the Spanish king is good, we just got to get him back on the throne to put things back the way they should be. So these loyalists, they like monarchy. They think it's the best government system, basically. There's another group who become known as the autonomists. And they say that they do like the Spanish king. They want to see him back on the throne in Spain. But they want to kind of govern their colonies more locally. They want more local power to make decision for their own colonies to set policy. So the autonomists want more kind of home rule over the colony, but they still want to stay a colony within the overall Spanish Empire, loyal to the Spanish king. And the third group are the real radicals of all this. They want to start a revolution and completely break the colony away from the Spanish Empire and proclaim full independence as a completely new country. So these so-called separatists, they want to separate from the Spanish Empire and go for full independence. They are the most radical, seen as the most extreme in the colonies. And a lot of the colonists are, their general populations are fairly conservative by this point. So the loyalists and the autonomists were probably the majority of the colonial populations, at least amongst the kind of Spanish European elite that are in the colonies. And many historians write that the kind of native and racial revolts in the late 1700s really contributed a lot to this, because a lot of those loyalists and autonomists who want to stay in the empire. They say that that kind of chaos is what happens when you get rid of monarchy and you basically destabilize the government. So their argument is we need monarchy for stability. So we need that Spanish king, and we need that tie to the rest of the Spanish Empire in order to keep the chaos of native revolt and racial massacre and racial infighting, racial civil war, basically. We need to keep that out of the colonies, so we want to keep the government nice and stable, so they like monarchy. A group called the Central Junta will become the kind of central decision making and military coordinating body for all these various revolutions and rebellions going on throughout the peninsula. So the Central Junta is kind of the central Spanish and Portuguese politicians and kind of head generals. That's where the planning occurs. So they're like the kind of default Spanish government for people that want to fight this kind of revolutionary war. And most of the Spanish, they do call it a revolution. It's generally known as the War of Independence in Spanish history. And it starts in 1808 and goes for quite a while. A lot of the English-speaking world call it something different. Like the British call it the Peninsular War. And you can see that down in the kind of corner of the map here. So that's how the British think of it. This is just one war fought in this one peninsula as compared to the other areas that Britain is fighting against Napoleon really around the world by this point. So the Central Junta, they work closely with the colonies at first, but the colonies have they have their own interests, to put it mildly. So they don't really coordinate that well with the Central Junta, and the Central Junta kind of gets into arguments with the colonies over its 2 years, and the Central Junta basically accuses the colonists very often just of acting in their own interest, whereas the colonists say, no, we're doing what we can because we love the Spanish king. We're acting in his interest while he's absent. So there's conflict between the Central Junta and the colonies. The bigger story, though, is that the French armies keep winning battles in this war. And eventually they really forced the Central Junta to disband and not just retreat, but to go into hiding so they don't get captured and executed. So when the Central Junta formally disbands itself in fear in 1810, they hand over power to what they call the Regency Council, which is really a council of advisors theoretically working for the Spanish king, Ferdinand VII, to try to kind of control and direct and gain resources for the continuation of this revolutionary movement. So the Regency Council is largely another Spanish-type government that's going to try to run the war against France. And this council will write a whole new Spanish constitution, or at least will start the process in 1810. And that constitution will do a lot of Enlightenment type things. They'll guarantee kind of popular citizen rights and voting rights, because the Spanish are going to start, under this constitution, will start voting on a parliament, elected representatives, and the parliament will become known as the Cortes. And that parliament will supposedly represent not just the people in Spain itself, but will also hold elections in the colonies to elect colonists to come to Spain and take part in the Cortes, the parliament. And the Regency Council was hesitant to do that because once you give voting rights and representation to the colonies, that could get out of control because the colonies have a very large population and they represent a huge landmass compared to the size of Spain. So it's very quickly understood that if the colonies get their equal representation kind of per person as Spain does, then the colonies will actually have a majority in the parliament, and they'll be able to just vote as a bloc and do whatever they want. So the Cortes in 1810, as they start to come together, um, they will formally declare Spain and the colonies as, quote, equal parts of one nation. So one people just living in different parts of the world. So that's a big quote that inspires a lot of colonists to kind of think of themselves not just as colonists, but as citizens in the Spanish Empire, with all the rights and privileges of any other Spanish citizen, no matter where they are. But the bigger constitution will be finished. The Cortes will write that, and will be finished in 1812. So some textbooks call it the Constitution of Cadiz, where it was eventually kind of created and signed off on, or the Constitution of 1812. So again, that depends on which textbook you're looking in, which documentary, or which historian you're talking to. So the Constitution of Cadiz is very much a kind of Enlightenment liberal document. It creates a separation of government powers, so there'll be a legislature and a court system and an executive. The Spanish monarchy, the Spanish king, will be the head of the executive branch. It creates full citizenship rights under the law. And the Constitution will give local autonomy to colonial governments. So the colonies are still part of the Spanish Empire, but will give those colonies a lot more leeway in making a lot of their own laws and kind of policies. So Napoleon wants to destroy this constitution because it's a threat to his control over Spain. And eventually he'll even release Ferdinand VII from that French palace in 1813 and send him back home to Spain because he believes that Ferdinand VII hates his constitution also. So Napoleon basically wants to, throw a giant troublemaker into Spain to reclaim the Spanish throne, maybe, or some amount of authority, and so that he can argue against and destroy this constitution. Because Ferdinand VII, he doesn't really believe in citizenship and equality and all these full rights and whatnot. He's an absolutist. He wants as much power for the monarchy as he can possibly get, and he doesn't like the idea of sharing power with the legislature. So Napoleon knows that, and so he sends Ferdinand VII into Spain in 1813 to try to basically undercut the Constitution and undercut Spanish unity in fighting off the French. What happens after the Spanish king gets back into Spain in 1813? He's overwhelmed by larger problems out in the colonies, where you're going to start having fighting in the colonies also. There's still some French traders that are trying to get into the colonies. There's still some French diplomats that are trying to take over the colonies. So there's also civil wars that break out in the colonies during all this, in the early 18 teens. And these civil wars will have a couple of different kind of factions. And two of those factions fight against each other. And that's basically the Spanish revolutionaries who want to overthrow French control of Spain, versus French colonizers that are trying to come into the colonies and attach the colonies to the larger French Empire. So there's a civil war between kind of Spanish loyalists and French colonists. But the larger civil wars that start to break out in the colonies will really be between the Spanish and themselves. So between Spanish loyalists who want to, even if they talk about, having some local autonomy in their colony, they still want to be part of the Spanish Empire, and they still want to be under the authority of the Spanish king. And they will fight against the autonomists who want a full-scale revolution to break this colony away from the Spanish Empire and make it into a whole new country. So again, radicalism starts to grow in the 18 teens as a direct result of the instability of politics in Spain itself and in Europe itself. one big problem for a lot of those kind of autonomous and independence driven movements in the colonies is the very fact that Napoleon's going to start losing in 1813. And Napoleon is forced to abdicate in April 1814. So he's forced to retire, basically. They're going to put him into exile in 1815 at the island of St. Helena, which is much, much further down in the South Atlantic, because they figure having him too close to Europe would be dangerous. So they imprison him on this little rock out in the middle of the southern Atlantic Ocean. And so he's put there in 1815, and he dies fairly mysteriously a few years later, like 1821, 22, something like that. I don't remember the exact year. And of course, that brings independence back to Spain. They've won their independence movement. And their king, Ferdinand VII, gets back onto his throne in 1814 when Napoleon was first defeated. And he's going to run the country as king. His problem, though, for the kind of short and long term for the rest of his life, is he is king under the Constitution of 1812. So he doesn't really like that because the Constitution limits the monarchy's power. And he's friends with a lot of the Spanish elite, the big landowners, who are very conservative, and they hate the Constitution, so they advise him to get rid of it, to trash it. And he does that in 1814. He overthrows the Constitution himself, and he declares really a kind of whole new government under his leadership. And that'll be an absolutist government. So it's going to be a full monarchy. And so Ferdinand VII shows kind of his true colors. He'll make promises of citizen equality and kind of elected legislature and all that. But when he gets the chance, he gets rid of all that stuff to maintain power for his own position. So he will basically run Spain as an absolutist monarch. He tries to rebuild his absolutist powers as much as possible, and he also tries to regain control over all these American colonies that have started rebellion movements in the 18 teens. He really fails at both of those, so there's a lot of government instability, and there is a liberal revolt against him in 1820 where they really take him prisoner, and they threaten to do things to him unless he promises to restore the old Constitution. So under personal threat, he agreed to do that. So in 1820, the Constitution of Cadiz comes back, and you get the representative government, the voting rights, the citizen rights again, but the king is still the executive branch. So the king doesn't appear to like this very much. He only put up with it because they threatened him, and that was his kind of escape from being murdered or something, very literally. So he's still in the executive branch. He's running the executive branch of government. He's enforcing the laws and running foreign policy and all that normal executive branch duties. Until a new French king comes into power, and in 1823 decides to try to get Spain back as an absolutist country. So France, the French king in 1823, sends a French army into Spain to kind of release Ferdinand VII from his captors, or what he calls his captors, and really put him back on his absolutist throne and give him back all those powers. And he's very open to this idea. So Ferdinand VII, makes a deal with the French government, the French king, basically to keep a French army in Spain to enforce the return of his powers, and he again gets rid of the Constitution and starts up a new absolutist state. And that's really where Spain will stay for the next 10 years until Ferdinand VII dies in 1833. He is dependent, reliant on a foreign French army, really to keep him on his throne, because his getting rid of the Constitution again really outraged a lot of the Spanish population. So we see Ferdinand VII kind of going back and forth regarding the Constitution or absolutism. depending on the circumstances of the moment. But in every instance where he has an opportunity to get rid of the Constitution, it appears that he does. So that's kind of the longer term for the Spanish government. And that's the kind of background that we're going to have to understand in order to analyze the major independence revolution movements, colonies that we'll talk about over the next several lectures that will kind of create independence for a lot of those colonies and will make them into the new countries.